Sometimes destiny does not knock politely. Sometimes it curls up on your porch, soaked by the rain, daring you to walk away. The storm rolled across the Pine Hollow forest with a steady roar, sending sheets of rain through towering evergreens and turning the narrow dirt paths into shallow streams. Most people had hurried home long before sunset, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the distant rumble of thunder to keep the woods company. Emily Carter tightened the wool shawl around her shoulders as she hurried along the muddy trail, balancing a basket filled with fresh herbs she had gathered for the village clinic. At 22, she had learned that life rarely became easier simply because someone hoped it would. She lived alone in a modest wooden cabin nearly a mile outside the village, where the forest offered peace that people often did not. Many believed in Omega should never choose such an isolated life, but Emily had grown accustomed to quiet mornings, simple routines, and evenings spent reading beside a warm fireplace. She preferred the honesty of nature over the whispers that followed her through crowded streets. As another flash of lightning lit the sky, she noticed an unusual shape near the edge of the trail. At first, she assumed it was nothing more than a fallen tree branch, but when another bolt briefly illuminated the clearing, she froze. A massive gray wolf lay curled beneath an old oak tree, soaked from head to tail, its thick fur matted with rainwater. One amber eye slowly opened the moment Emily stepped closer. The wolf released a low warning growl, not loud enough to threaten, but clear enough to demand distance. Emily stopped immediately, keeping several feet between them. She lowered her basket onto the wet ground and quietly knelt without making another move. "Easy," she whispered. "I am not here to hurt you." The wolf answered by turning its head away, as though exhausted by the effort of simply watching her. Its breathing remained slow but uneven, and despite its impressive size, there was something strangely lonely about the way it refused to meet her eyes again. Emily carefully studied the animal from where she remained. She found no obvious injuries, no hunting traps, and no broken bones that she could see. It simply looked tired beyond words, as though it had wandered for days without finding a place safe enough to rest. Rain continued to pour across its broad back, while cold winds swept through the clearing. Emily quietly removed the thick wool blanket folded inside her basket. The blanket had been meant for an elderly patient in the village, but another could easily be woven before winter arrived. She slowly slid the blanket across the muddy ground, instead of placing it directly on the wolf. The animal watched every movement with suspicious eyes, its ears lifting slightly as though weighing whether to flee. It did neither. Emily stood again, taking one slow step backward to show she expected nothing in return. "You do not have to trust me," she said softly, "but you do not have to stay in the rain either." She turned toward her cabin only a short walk away, convinced the wolf would disappear the moment she left. Yet after only a few steps, she heard the faint sound of heavy paws pressing into wet earth behind her. She glanced over one shoulder without stopping. The gray wolf had risen. It still carried itself with quiet caution, still kept a respectful distance, and still looked thoroughly unimpressed by her presence. But it was following her. Not because it trusted her, perhaps. Not because it wanted company. Only because somewhere beneath all that stubborn pride, even the grumpiest stray sometimes needed a place that felt like home. Emily Carter paused at the cabin door and pushed it open with one careful hand while the gray wolf remained several yards behind her, watching every movement with guarded amber eyes. Warm firelight spilled across the small front porch, carrying the comforting scent of cedar wood and dried herbs into the cool evening air. She stepped inside first, leaving the door open without saying another word. If the wolf wanted shelter, it would choose for itself. If not, she would not force it. Several quiet moments passed before she heard slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the wooden porch. When she turned around, the wolf had settled just inside the doorway, dripping rainwater across the floor while studying every corner of the cabin with cautious suspicion. Emily smiled faintly. "You can stay until the storm passes," she whispered. "That is all I ask." The wolf responded by looking away as though it had no interest in her kindness whatsoever. Emily hung her soaked shawl beside the fireplace before placing a cast iron pot over the flames. Soon the rich aroma of vegetable stew filled the cabin. She carefully placed a wooden bowl on the floor several feet from the wolf, adding pieces of roasted chicken she had saved from the previous evening. The animal glanced toward the bowl, but refused to move. Instead, it sat with remarkable dignity, pretending the food did not exist. Emily quietly served herself dinner at the small wooden table without watching him. Nearly 10 minutes later, she heard the faint scrape of the bowl sliding across the floor. Without turning her head, she smiled to herself. By the time she washed her dishes, every bite had disappeared. The following morning, Emily awoke before sunrise to discover muddy paw prints leading across her freshly swept floor. A basket of folded laundry had somehow ended up beside the fireplace. One chair had been pushed halfway across the room, and several books now rested beneath the window where she distinctly remembered leaving them on a shelf. She looked toward the wolf, who was lying peacefully near the door with his eyes closed, looking entirely innocent. "You have been busy," she said with gentle amusement. One ear twitched, but otherwise he refused to acknowledge her. Throughout the day, the strange routine continued. Whenever Emily worked in her herb garden behind the cabin, the wolf followed from a distance while pretending to inspect the forest instead. When she collected fresh water from the nearby creek, he appeared quietly on the opposite bank as though coincidence alone had brought him there. Every time she spoke to him, he deliberately looked in another direction, maintaining the appearance of complete indifference. Yet he never wandered far. By the second evening, Emily noticed something even stranger. The wolf always waited until she entered the cabin before lying down outside the front steps. It was almost as if he believed keeping watch was somehow his responsibility, although he would never admit such a thing. During the night, Emily awoke after hearing the cabin door creak softly. Through the window, she caught a brief glimpse of the gray wolf disappearing silently into the moonlit forest. She frowned with quiet curiosity. "Where are you going?" she whispered to the empty room. No answer came. Just before dawn, she heard those same heavy footsteps returning to the porch. Opening the door, she found the wolf sitting exactly where he had been before leaving, his thick fur carrying the scent of mountain air and pine needles. He looked tired, almost burdened, but the moment Emily knelt to examine him, he stood and walked away several feet with an annoyed huff, clearly refusing any inspection. Emily laughed softly. "You truly are the grumpiest guest I have ever met." The wolf glanced back for the briefest moment. His expression remained proud and stubborn, but somewhere behind those guarded amber eyes, the loneliness she had noticed in the storm still lingered, hidden beneath a heart that seemed determined never to need anyone again. The third morning arrived wrapped in silver mist that drifted quietly through the towering pines surrounding Emily Carter's cabin. Sunlight struggled to break through the heavy clouds, painting the forest in soft shades of gold and gray. Emily opened her front door with a basket resting on her arm, expecting to find the grumpy gray wolf asleep on the porch as he had been every morning since arriving. Instead, the porch stood empty. The blanket she had left there remained neatly folded, untouched except for a few strands of gray fur dancing in the cool breeze. Emily scanned the tree line with quiet concern. "You left early again," she murmured to herself. She tried to convince herself that wild animals naturally wandered wherever they pleased, yet an unexpected feeling of disappointment settled inside her chest. It surprised her how quickly the strange visitor had become part of her daily routine. She gathered fresh herbs near the creek, watered the small vegetable garden behind the cabin, and spent several hours preparing medicine for the elderly families living in the nearby village. Every so often, her eyes drifted toward the forest, half expecting to catch a glimpse of familiar gray fur between the trees. Nothing appeared. By midday, she traveled into Pine Hollow Village carrying carefully wrapped bundles of herbal remedies. The market square buzzed with nervous conversations unlike anything she had heard before. Merchants spoke in hushed voices. Children stayed close to their parents. Even the blacksmith had paused his work to listen as several royal messengers rode through the center of town. Their horses carried the silver crest of the kingdom, and their expressions remained unusually serious. One messenger raised his voice for everyone to hear. By order of the Royal Council, all citizens are asked to report any unusual wolf sightings within the surrounding forests. His Majesty, King Alexander Ashford, has been missing for 3 days. Search parties have been dispatched throughout the kingdom. The square fell completely silent. Emily stood motionless beside the village fountain, trying to understand what she had just heard. The Alpha King was missing. She had never seen him in person, only the carefully painted portraits hanging inside the village hall. People described him as wise, calm, and fiercely devoted to protecting every corner of the kingdom. It seemed impossible that someone so respected could simply disappear. Some say he vanished during a patrol, one merchant whispered. Others believe enemies captured him. I heard he transformed before anyone could stop him, another villager quietly replied. Emily listened without joining the conversation. Rumors always traveled faster than truth. She collected her empty baskets after delivering the medicine and began the long walk home beneath the fading afternoon sun. As she reached the familiar forest trail, she noticed fresh paw prints pressed into the damp earth ahead of her. Large, familiar. They followed the same winding path toward her cabin. Her pace quickened without realizing it. When the little wooden house finally came into view, she found the gray wolf, sitting beside the front steps exactly as though he had never left. He looked toward her only briefly before turning his head with practiced indifference. Emily let out a quiet breath she had not realized she had been holding. "You really do enjoy making people worry," she said with gentle relief. The wolf responded with a soft huff that sounded suspiciously like annoyance. She knelt and noticed tiny pine needles clinging to his thick fur along with droplets of fresh mountain water. Wherever he disappeared each night, it was somewhere far beyond the familiar trails surrounding her home. As Emily reached out, the wolf stepped away exactly one pace before sitting again, carefully maintaining the same respectful distance he always insisted upon. She laughed softly. "You are still determined not to let me get too close." The wolf remained silent, but his amber eyes lingered on her a heartbeat longer than usual before slowly looking away. High above the quiet forest, hidden beyond the distant mountain ridge, dozens of royal riders continued searching every road and valley for their missing king, never imagining that the one they sought had already found the only place where he had truly been treated as nothing more than a weary soul in need of kindness. Late that afternoon, the peaceful rhythm surrounding Emily Carter's little cabin changed without warning. The gray wolf had been resting beneath the old maple tree near the garden, pretending complete indifference while secretly watching Emily gather fresh lavender and mint for the next day's remedies. The quiet was broken by the distant sound of horses moving steadily along the forest road. The wolf lifted his head immediately. His ears turned toward the approaching sound, and every muscle in his body became perfectly still. Emily noticed the change at once. "What is it?" she asked softly. The wolf did not answer, of course, but his amber eyes remained fixed on the trees beyond the narrow trail leading toward the cabin. Only moments later, mounted royal guards emerged from the forest wearing polished silver cloaks embroidered with the crest of the kingdom. Their horses slowed as they reached the clearing, and the leader offered Emily a respectful nod before climbing down from his saddle. "Good afternoon," the captain said politely. "I apologize for disturbing your day." Emily returned the greeting with a calm smile. "How may I help you?" The captain removed his gloves before speaking. "We are searching every village and every woodland home. His Majesty remains missing, and we have reason to believe an unusually large gray wolf has been seen throughout this region. Have you noticed anything out of the ordinary during the past 3 days?" Emily felt her heartbeat quicken, though her expression remained composed. She glanced only briefly toward the maple tree. The wolf had disappeared without making the slightest sound. If she had not been watching him moments earlier, she would have believed he had never been there at all. Emily looked back toward the captain. "I have seen deer, foxes, rabbits, and plenty of birds," she answered honestly. "But nothing dangerous." The captain studied her face for a moment before nodding. Several villagers reported large paw prints nearby. "We cannot ignore any possibility." Emily hesitated for only a second. "The forest has always belonged to wolves," she replied gently. "Most avoid people unless they are frightened." One of the younger guards spoke quietly. "Some believe this wolf is different." Emily smiled politely. "Perhaps it simply wishes to be left alone." The captain accepted her answer without argument. "If you notice anything unusual, please send word to the village immediately. We only wish to bring our king home safely." "Of course," Emily answered. The guards thanked her and continued deeper into the forest until the sound of hooves slowly disappeared beneath the towering pines. Silence settled over the clearing once again. Emily remained standing outside for several long moments before quietly walking toward the back of the cabin. "You can come out now," she whispered. At first nothing moved. Then the gray wolf stepped silently from behind a stack of neatly cut firewood, his expression as stubborn as ever. Emily folded her arms and smiled with quiet amusement. "You certainly know how to disappear." The wolf looked away as though her observation deserved no response. She walked closer, stopping several feet away to respect the invisible boundary he always maintained. "I do not know why they are searching for a wolf," she said softly, "but I could tell you did not want them to see you." The wolf held her gaze for the first time that day. There was no fear in his eyes, only deep caution mixed with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Emily slowly picked up a wooden water bowl and placed it beside the porch before stepping back again. "Whatever your story is," she said quietly, "you will not have to explain it until you are ready." The wolf remained perfectly still. As the evening sun slipped behind the mountains, warm golden light settled across the clearing, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, the proud gray wolf lowered his head ever so slightly before drinking from the fresh water she had left for him, a silent gesture so small that anyone else might have missed it, yet to Emily it felt like the beginning of trust. Night settled gently over Pine Hollow Forest as the third day came to an end. A brilliant full moon slowly climbed above the mountain peaks, bathing the trees in silver light, while the cool evening breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers through the quiet clearing. Emily Carter finished washing the last of the wooden dishes before placing another bowl of warm stew beside the front door. As always, the gray wolf ignored the meal at first, choosing instead to sit at the edge of the porch with his back toward her, watching the moon in complete silence. Emily stepped outside, holding a wool blanket around her shoulders. She leaned lightly against the porch railing, following his gaze toward the glowing sky. "You always become restless when the moon is full," she said softly. "Perhaps tonight you will finally tell me where you disappear every evening." The wolf remained perfectly still. His amber eyes reflected the moonlight with unusual intensity, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, his breathing became noticeably uneven. Emily frowned with quiet concern. "Are you feeling sick?" she asked as she slowly took one careful step closer. The wolf stood immediately, not with anger, but with urgency. He moved several feet away, his body tense as though fighting against something invisible. Emily stopped exactly where she was. She had already learned that pushing him only made him retreat farther. "All right," she whispered. "I will stay here." Several long moments passed beneath the silent moon. The forest itself seemed to pause. Even the usual chorus of crickets faded into stillness. Then the wolf lifted his head toward the sky. His entire posture softened before a strange silver glow slowly surrounded his massive form. Emily blinked, convinced exhaustion had begun playing tricks on her eyes. The gentle light grew brighter, wrapping around the wolf like drifting moonlight caught in a slow wind. She instinctively stepped backward, not from fear, but from complete disbelief. The familiar outline of the animal gradually shifted. Broad shoulders straightened. Powerful forelegs slowly became human arms. Thick gray fur disappeared beneath flowing silver light until a tall man stood where the wolf had been only moments before. Emily forgot to breathe. Before her stood a man who looked no older than 30, with dark brown hair falling neatly across his forehead, striking blue eyes, and calm features carrying both quiet authority and unmistakable exhaustion. A dark cloak lay around his shoulders, appearing almost as naturally as the transformation itself. The stranger lowered his gaze for a moment before looking directly at Emily. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt almost sacred. Emily searched his face, trying desperately to understand what she had just witnessed. Then memory returned all at once. The royal portraits hanging inside the village hall. The noble features. The blue eyes. The calm expression every painter had tried to capture. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "You are." The man gave a slow, almost reluctant nod. "Alexander Ashford." Emily's eyes widened. The missing Alpha King stood only a few feet away from her weathered little cabin. For 3 days she had shared meals with him, worried about him, spoken to him as though he were nothing more than a lonely stray wolf seeking shelter from the rain. She expected him to step back into royal pride, to demand answers or explanations. but instead he lowered his head with quiet humility. "I owe you an apology," he said gently, his voice calm and warm despite obvious fatigue. "I accepted your kindness while hiding the truth." Emily stared at him, still trying to connect the proud wolf with the composed king before her. Then, almost without thinking, she smiled the same gentle smile she had offered on the night they first met. "You were cold," she said simply. "That mattered more than your name." Alexander remained completely still. Countless people across the kingdom respected his title. Others feared his authority. But no one had ever looked at him the way this quiet Omega did, seeing neither a king nor a legend, only someone who had needed a warm place to rest. Beneath the silver moon, surrounded by whispering pines and the little cabin that had unknowingly become his refuge, the Alpha King realized that the greatest gift he had received during his disappearance had never been shelter from the storm. It had been the rare kindness of someone who had asked for absolutely nothing in return. For several quiet minutes, neither Emily Carter nor Alexander Ashford moved. The moonlight stretched across the porch, turning the damp wooden boards into ribbons of silver while the forest breathed softly around them. Emily finally broke the silence with the same calm voice she had used since the night she found him beneath the old oak tree. "You should come inside," she said. "The night is getting colder." Alexander looked at the open cabin door before meeting her eyes again. "You are inviting a stranger into your home," he replied. Emily smiled gently. "I already did that 3 days ago. Now I simply know your name." A faint expression of surprise crossed his face before he quietly followed her inside. The familiar warmth of the fireplace filled the room. Emily poured hot herbal tea into 2 simple ceramic mugs and placed one before him without ceremony. The Alpha King studied the humble kitchen, the neatly stacked books, the drying herbs hanging from wooden beams, and the little cabin that somehow felt more peaceful than the grand halls of his palace. "You live here alone?" he asked. Emily nodded. "It is peaceful. People expect Omegas to stay close to others, but I have always liked quiet places." Alexander wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "Peace is rarer than most people realize." Emily noticed the tiredness behind his composed expression. "You do not have to explain anything," she said softly. "But I think you have been carrying something much heavier than the rain." Alexander remained silent for a long moment before speaking. 3 nights ago, I traveled through the northern mountains alone after receiving troubling reports from several border villages. On my return journey, I found myself caught in a powerful surge of moon magic. It happens only on rare occasions to those born into the oldest alpha bloodlines. When the transformation begins unexpectedly, it cannot be controlled. I remained trapped in my wolf form far longer than I ever had before. Emily listened quietly, never interrupting. "I could still think clearly," Alexander continued, "but speaking became impossible. Returning to the capital would have frightened the people, and revealing myself before the transformation ended would have created confusion throughout the kingdom. So I stayed hidden, waiting for the magic to weaken." He gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I expected solitude. Instead, I found someone who offered shelter without asking a single question." Emily looked down at her tea. "You looked lonely," she admitted. That was enough. Alexander's expression softened. "Do you know what most people do when they recognize me?" Emily slowly shook her head. "They bow. They become nervous. Every word they speak is carefully measured because they see a crown before they see a person." His blue eyes rested gently on hers. "You offered me food before you offer me questions." Emily laughed quietly. "Well, you certainly did not make a very friendly first impression." For the first time since arriving at the cabin, Alexander smiled without restraint. It was warm, genuine, and unexpectedly youthful. "I suppose I did not." The comfortable silence returned, no longer awkward, but peaceful. The fire crackled softly while the wind whispered against the windows. Emily realized that beneath the title of Alpha King sat a man carrying responsibilities few could imagine. Alexander, in turn, looked at the woman who had unknowingly reminded him what ordinary kindness felt like. She had expected nothing from him, asked for no reward, and never treated him differently after learning who he truly was. That simple truth settled quietly within his heart. He had spent years protecting his kingdom, believing strength alone could keep it safe. Yet during 3 unexpected days inside a modest cabin, an Omega with gentle eyes had shown him that compassion could restore something even power could not. And as dawn slowly approached beyond the forest, both of them sensed that the story unfolding between them had only just begun. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the pine branches just as the peaceful silence surrounding Emily Carter's cabin was interrupted by the distant sound of galloping horses. This time there were many more than before. Alexander Ashford stepped onto the porch, his expression calm but thoughtful as he listened to the approaching riders. Emily joined him a moment later, following the sound until flashes of silver armor appeared between the trees. Within minutes, nearly 20 royal guards entered the clearing, accompanied by several distinguished advisors dressed in deep blue cloaks embroidered with the royal crest. The moment they caught sight of Alexander, every rider stopped at once. One by one they climbed down from their horses and bowed deeply. The captain who had visited the cabin the previous afternoon lowered his head with visible relief. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "The kingdom has searched every valley and every mountain. We feared the worst." Alexander offered a reassuring nod. "I am well. There is no cause for alarm." The captain looked toward Emily with clear surprise before returning his attention to the king. "It was here, all this time?" "Yes," Alexander answered simply. "This cabin became my refuge." Several advisors exchanged uncertain glances. One elderly nobleman stepped forward with careful diplomacy. "Your Majesty, the Royal Council awaits your immediate return. Matters of state cannot be delayed any longer." Alexander remained composed. "I will return." Before anyone could speak again, he turned toward Emily. "But first, there is someone I wish to acknowledge." Every eye in the clearing shifted toward the quiet Omega standing beside the porch. Emily suddenly became very aware of her simple linen dress, her gardening gloves still resting in one hand, and the loose strands of hair moved gently by the morning breeze. She had never imagined standing before the entire royal escort. One younger advisor quietly whispered to another, clearly puzzled that an ordinary village woman stood so comfortably beside their king. Alexander noticed the exchange immediately. His voice remained calm, yet carried the quiet authority that required no raised volume. "Emily Carter offered shelter when she believed I was nothing more than a weary wolf seeking protection from a storm. She asked for no payment, expected no favor, and never sought recognition." Silence spread across the clearing. The captain looked toward Emily again, this time with unmistakable respect. Another advisor lowered his eyes, realizing what those simple words truly meant. While the entire kingdom had searched desperately for its missing ruler, one compassionate stranger had protected him without ever knowing who he was. Emily shifted uncomfortably beneath so many watchful eyes. "I only did what anyone should have done," she said softly. Alexander smiled gently. "You did what many would have forgotten to do." The words settled over everyone present. No one argued. The forest itself seemed unusually still, as though even the wind had paused to listen. The captain stepped forward and placed one hand respectfully over his heart before addressing Emily directly. "On behalf of the royal guard, thank you for protecting our king." Emily looked almost embarrassed by the attention. "He protected himself," she answered with a small smile. "I simply shared my home." A few quiet smiles appeared among the guards. Even the older advisors seemed touched by her humility. Alexander walked toward his waiting horse, but stopped before mounting. He looked back at the little cabin nestled among the pines, the herb garden carefully tended beside the porch, and the woman whose kindness had quietly changed something inside him. For the first time in many years, returning to the palace no longer felt like returning home. As the royal escort prepared to depart, Alexander met Emily's eyes one last time. No promises were spoken, no grand declarations filled the air. Yet both of them understood that what had begun as an unexpected meeting beneath a storm had become a bond that neither distance nor duty would easily erase. The forest felt strangely quiet after the royal escort disappeared beyond the towering pines. Emily Carter stood on her porch for several long moments, watching the empty trail until even the sound of horses had faded into memory. Then she returned to her ordinary routine. She watered the herbs growing beside the cabin, gathered fresh vegetables from the small garden, and prepared medicine for families in Pine Hollow Village. Everything looked exactly as it had before, yet everything somehow felt different. Every morning, she still found herself glancing toward the old maple tree, half expecting to see a proud gray wolf pretending not to watch her. Every evening, she paused before closing the cabin door, remembering the quiet companion who had once guarded the porch through the night. Days passed, then nearly 2 weeks. Life slowly settled into familiar rhythms again, although an unexpected emptiness remained. One bright autumn afternoon, Emily carried a basket of herbal remedies into the village marketplace. Before she reached the first row of shops, she noticed colorful banners hanging from nearly every building. Fresh flowers decorated the streets, musicians tuned their instruments, and children laughed while helping neighbors prepare long wooden tables across the town square. Curious, Emily approached the bakery. "What is everyone celebrating?" she asked. The baker smiled broadly. "You have not heard? His Majesty has returned safely to the capital. Tomorrow he begins a royal tour to personally thank every community that supported the search." Emily smiled warmly. "That is wonderful news." She quietly continued delivering medicine, hoping the excitement would soon settle. Instead, it grew even larger the following morning. Before sunrise, the distant sound of trumpets echoed across the valley. Villagers hurried outside as elegant carriages and mounted royal guards entered Pine Hollow with graceful precision. The entire marketplace filled with respectful silence. Emily remained near the edge of the crowd, perfectly content to watch from a distance. She had no desire to stand out. The royal carriage stopped in the center of the square. Alexander Ashford stepped onto the cobblestone street, dressed in a simple navy coat rather than ceremonial robes. Although surrounded by advisors and guards, his attention immediately searched the gathered faces until it found Emily standing quietly beside the village fountain. A gentle smile appeared before he greeted the townspeople. He thanked the villagers for their loyalty, praised the courage of the search parties, and spoke warmly about the strength of ordinary people who cared for one another during uncertain times. Then, to everyone's surprise, he stepped away from the prepared platform and walked directly through the crowd toward Emily. Villagers instinctively moved aside, exchanging puzzled whispers as the Alpha King stopped only a few feet from the quiet Omega. Emily bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty." Alexander shook his head with a faint smile. "When we first met, you did not know my title." Emily looked up with quiet amusement. "That was before I recognized you." "And yet," he replied gently, "I preferred the way you looked at me then." The surrounding crowd watched in complete silence. Alexander reached into his coat and carefully removed a small wooden carving shaped like a wolf. It had clearly been crafted by hand rather than by a royal artisan. "During the days I stayed at your cabin," he said softly, "I noticed the small carvings on your bookshelf. I remembered you admired simple things more than expensive ones." Emily accepted the gift with genuine surprise. The polished wood felt warm in her hands. "You made this?" Alexander nodded. On the journey back to the capital, Emily smiled, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. Around them, villagers began to understand that the bond between their king and the gentle woman before him had never been built upon titles, wealth, or ceremony. It had begun with a bowl of warm food, an open door, and a kindness offered without expecting anything in return. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter, and the hills surrounding Pine Hollow Forest shimmered beneath the first light dusting of snow. Emily Carter continued living exactly as she always had, tending her small herb garden, preparing remedies for the village, and greeting every sunrise from the porch of the little cabin that had quietly changed both her life and someone else's. The carved wooden wolf Alexander Ashford had given her rested beside the window where morning sunlight touched it every day. She never considered it a royal gift. To her, it was simply a reminder that kindness could leave footprints long after a storm had passed. Meanwhile, throughout the kingdom, stories spread from village to village. People spoke of a king who had returned from his disappearance calmer than before, one who listened more carefully, visited ordinary families more often, and reminded his council that true leadership began with understanding those who possessed neither titles nor wealth. Few knew the quiet reason behind those changes. On the first clear morning of spring, a familiar procession once again entered Pine Hollow, though this time it was much smaller. There were no musicians, no elaborate ceremony, and no long line of advisors. Only a handful of royal guards accompanied Alexander as he approached the little cabin on horseback. Emily looked up from her herb garden and smiled the moment she recognized him. "You found your way back," she said warmly. Alexander smiled in return. "I believe I left something important here." Emily glanced playfully around the porch. "I have not seen another lost wolf." Alexander laughed, the sound carrying easily through the quiet forest. "Neither have I." They walked together beneath the tall pines where they had first met only months before. Nothing about the forest had truly changed. The old oak tree still stretched its branches toward the sky. The narrow trail still wound peacefully through the woods. Birds still sang above the whispering leaves. Yet both of them understood that they were no longer the same people who had crossed those paths during the storm. Alexander stopped beside the clearing and looked toward Emily with quiet sincerity. "There have been many grand halls where I was welcomed because of my crown," he said. "But there has only been one place where I was welcomed simply because someone believed no living soul should face the rain alone." Emily lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "I only offered what anyone deserves." Alexander gently shook his head. "That is exactly why it mattered." He extended his hand, not as a command from a king, but as an invitation from a man who had learned that respect could never be demanded, only earned. Emily accepted it with an easy smile, and together they turned toward the cabin where their story had quietly begun. No prophecy had brought them together. No ceremony had decided their future. It had started with compassion freely given and trust slowly earned, one ordinary day at a time. As the afternoon sun filtered through the trees, the little cabin no longer seemed small at all. It had become the place where an alpha king remembered his humanity and where an overlooked omega discovered that the greatest acts of courage often appeared in the simplest choices. Long after the seasons continued to change, travelers passing through Pine Hollow would sometimes notice a gray wolf resting peacefully beneath the old oak tree beside a modest wooden cabin. They would smile at the unusual sight before continuing on their journey, never realizing they had witnessed a quiet promise that needed no royal proclamation to endure. For some stories are remembered not because kingdoms were conquered or crowns were won, but because one gentle heart chose kindness before knowing who stood before it, proving that true strength is never measured by power alone, but by the compassion that transforms strangers into family and turns an unexpected shelter from the rain into the place both hearts would always call home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment, and what message or lesson did you take away from Evelyn and Alexander's journey? Share your opinion in the comments below and join the conversation with fellow story lovers. If you enjoyed this tale, please give the video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Alpha's Regret Stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our next exciting story filled with romance, drama, betrayal, and unforgettable twists. See you in the next story.